Hey guys, Youngblood with you for another episode of Exploring the Starmap, this time focusing on an old military system trying to find itself a new identity, being Keel. Now, Keel was first discovered in 2514 by some merchant marines who were delivering fuel in the Hadrian system, and they had a captain who liked to mix up his paths, not only to keep outlaws unfamiliar with their routes, but also to keep the crew on their toes ready for whatever may end up happening. Now, one time during one of these new routes that he was taking, their scanners picked up a strange anomaly, which they ended up checking out, and it turned out to be a jump point with the other end connecting to Kiel. Upon more research after arrival, it ended up being discovered that there were 6 planets total, with only one being a real terraforming candidate, being Keel 3. That being said, while only having one real terraforming option, the system was really rich in resources, so there was this big boom of people that were rushing in to make a profit. Now, with the increase in bodies and ships, there was also an increase in scanners, and eventually 2 other jump points were found leading to Baker and Horus, in addition to the one we already know about to Hadrian. While Baker is a relatively unpopular system thanks to the poor terraforming candidates in that system as well, the jump point to Horus is what had the military interested, as Horus is connected to xi'an space, making Kiel a new primary military staging ground system for support on the Perry Line. Now, if you're unfamiliar with that, the Perry Line was the military blockade in the front line during the Cold War with the xi'an, and would have been the first place for a battle should that have ever really happened. So having a dedicated military location in a system close by was a move the UEE felt necessary to make. Like anything military, a lot of money was sent into the system as part of the military expansion efforts, bolstering hangars, runways, factories, and really everything that was needed to support the engines of war. And even if that war never happened, it still ended up getting spent. Now, Keel 3 became a very large military installation that was housing a ton of ships that were ready to go at a moment's notice from Messer. The military money coming in was the primary source of income on this system, so once the Messer regime ended up falling, and the Cold War kind of subsided with the xi'an, the system ended up falling on hard times. The lack of any other real type of income from different business lines, and losing the money from the Navy and Army spending money here, civilian operations ended up just almost leaving the system mostly deserted. And it's been that way for a while, until recent changes have taken place on Keel 3 that's known as Severus. The Keel system overall has 6 planets in orbit, and it's all around a white main sequence star. The first planet, Keel 1, is a rocky, uninhabited planet, but it is tidally locked, meaning that one side of the planet is going to be extremely pot-marked from asteroid strikes, while the other sides kind of remain a lot more clean than the other. There is some mining that takes place on this planet, so those of you that have prospectors should be able to land here and earn some credits. Keel 2 is another rocky terrestrial planet that has a thin atmosphere, and while it is known to have a lot of resources, it's impossible to get rights to mine here as the military has restricted access from the surface and it denies any claims to mine. So even if they don't have much of a presence here anymore, they're still saying no, nobody can land here. So I could see this being an interesting place to do some illegal mining because there may be untold resources or secrets in waiting. And in fact, there's so much distrust here from the government that when people hear that there's no mining allowed after the military left, their imaginations were just left to wander, wondering what sort of dark things were happening here. Basically, the public was just really skeptical of anything that was happening on Keel 2 based on kind of the black veil that's been put over it. For those of you that want to do some risky exploring, explorers might want to get down there, see what they can find, because you can pretty much bet something is happening on this planet. The problem is we just don't really know what. Keel 3 is known as Severus and was a rocky planet that was the only one in the system to really have been terraformed. There is a moon in orbit around the planet that was named after Livia Messer's cousin. That's Amelia. Severus was named after an admiral from the Second Tevaran War, so we got some name rights going on. The planet is just littered with old military installations, and the planet sat with nothing going for it for a really long time after the military pulled out. Now, what ended up changing all of that was when a governor here, one who was a descendant of an old army member who ended up staying to make a living here, saw an opportunity. After years of trying to get businesses to arrive, he changed his focus from trying to get just anyone to come to getting specific companies to come with some targeted benefits. RSI was one of the ones that was targeted to come here and to be able to really just use some of the facilities that were already in place to produce thrusters for their ships. The profits generated via taxation on RSI ended up allowing them to build parks and apartments that ended up kind of improving the local area, which resulted in people beginning to move back into the system. After that, he looked around and saw these hangars everywhere, which weren't always a great option for companies since they're open air. That being said, they were a perfect option for storing craft and having conventions, so he targeted the Aerospace Expo, which was previously a rotating event around different systems. he was able to convince the Expo to make this their permanent location and to use the hangars to their advantage. The permanent yearly presence of the Expo hosted here on Severus has led to huge improvements in the economy and is now a popular tourist destination, meaning there's a lot of new attractions and restaurants and hotels that were opened, and there's now an actively developing area of this planet, meaning that we're starting to get a system that is more in a growth factor. And it's happening so much that the planet and the system now have representation in the Senate. Now, like with anything else, when profits come, so do criminals. So we've started seeing them come in and targeting tourists and trying to steal the specialized ships that are coming in for the Expo. For those that are interested in piracy, there should be a lot of good opportunities here to alleviate tourists of their Expo crew, of their goods and their ships and, really anything. But on the flip side of that, we should have escorts and mercenaries and bounty hunters that should have a lot of work here based on the presence of people wanting to do bad. Now, in this system, we do have an asteroid belt, and while it's been mined by the military to a pretty heavy degree, there's still a lot of mining options available. So if you're keeping track, that's now one planet we know you can mine on, another one that has a lot of resources if you can find a way to actually mine there, and now an asteroid belt with a lot of mining resources. Now, if you're into mining, you really need to consider this space, especially when there should be an asteroid belt of large size. A ship like an Orion could really chew through a lot of ore, and prospectors being able to hit that, plus the planet surfaces, make this a really attractive option. There are other opportunities in this belt other than mining resources, like the fact that there is a ton of salvageable ships in this location from the military that had accidents when doing mining or doing training runs, and not bothering to clean up their mess after they were done. So if you're a reclaimer pilot, or really any ship that's capable of doing some salvage, maybe like a Caterpillar or a Cutlass, this should be big bucks for you. Now, it's been a while since the military left, so I'm not counting on a ton of valuable components being here, but I think there's going to be a lot of metal available for you to kind of harvest. Keel 4 is a deep blue gas dwarf that contains a lot of methane. There isn't much here to do for players other than possibly harvesting methane if that becomes a thing, but it is nice to look at and has a very fast rotation, only taking about 16 standard Earth hours to complete its spin. Keel 5 is a gas giant with some beautiful shimmering rings. But the planet is mostly comprised of hydrogen and helium, so if you're looking to fill up a starfare, this should be a pretty good place to do it, especially considering it's a relatively unpopulated system outside of the one planet. So you may end up having a lot of fuel rescue calls if people stray too far out to the outer edges, meaning good options for income. And finally, we arrive at Keel 6, a protoplanet with a very slow orbit, taking about 126 Earth years to make it around the Keel star. At the end of every orbit, there is a big event that's planned on Severus to celebrate the completion of the orbit, and that event should draw a lot of money into the system and mean big opportunities in regards to selling goods and providing services. I also look at this system in general and don't really see this being like a self-sustaining type of place. So I think that there's going to be some very high dependence on transporting goods in and out of the system. So those of you that have cargo ships, you can probably sell at a fairly high rate in the system. And companies like RSI are probably going to contract to actually ship their goods like their maneuvering thrusters back out of the system. When we look at the jump points that are present here, Horus is interesting if you have desires to connect to the xi'an for trade. Hadrian actually also connects to xi'an space, but it's known as no man's land and has a this big primary shipping checkpoint. So smuggling here would be harder than somewhere else like Horus. At least that's my impression, especially considering outside of the trade lanes, there are a lot of mines that are present. The jump point to Baker is of relatively low interest, but we do know that Baker has a low population outside of the racers who are there. So if you're looking to jump into this system and do some piracy in Kiel and then maybe flee to an area with less security presence, that may be a good option for the less than lawful. I also see some interesting trade options when looking at these connections. A big cargo ship could provide goods to some relatively cut-off systems like Baker and Keel, and if they then wanted to continue on to do trade with the xi'an, you've got some interesting connections to those to that empire as well, so you could maybe end up maximizing your returns on your run. So that's the Keel system. It's a pretty big system with not a lot to do, but for miners and salvagers, I think it may be one of your better options. So if you have questions on this system, please let me know. Otherwise, I appreciate you guys watching. Have yourselves a wonderful day, and take care.